All right, so now that we've crossed past the offer profit and we've examined our treatments, examined all of the different offerings that we have and whether they're profitable, once we've concluded that they're profitable or we have a path forward into enhancing their profitability, now we move on to operating profit. And operating profit is what a lot of businesses call net profit or net margin. And this represents the ultimate profitability of your business. So while offer profit is the profitability of your offers, this is the profitability of the business that provides them. So there's a difference here because you can have a profitable offer and have a very much not profitable business. And the reason for that is overhead bloat. Overhead is basically all those costs that add up that are not related to the actual treatments or delivery of them. So think like your rent, your payroll for your front desk staff, your office expenses, your utility bills, your accounting services like me, your legal services, things like that. So if you're spending a lot of money and marketing, oh, don't forget marketing. If you're spending a lot of money on these types of services and offerings, then what you're going to run into is a crunch in your profitability on an ultimate net profit level. And that's why we call it operating profit, because it's the profit generated after operating your business, your clinic, your practice. And this is one of the most important metrics you can be tracking is ultimately, are you generating more profit, than you're spending? And that's what we're going to focus on today, deciding whether the business model actually works. So you can have offers that work and a business model that doesn't, meaning you're wasting a bunch of money in overhead, excess payroll. Maybe your commission structure doesn't make sense. Maybe you're overspending in certain areas of marketing. So we're going to uncover that today. The core idea is that operating profit tells you whether your growth makes the business easier or heavier to run. So, just like we talked about with the offer profit, by scaling and multiplying what is going on in your practice, you could either be causing chaos or causing calm. And you want to be able to figure out how to grow calmly. So, operating profit will help you figure out whether or not you want to multiply what you're already doing and add another location. This is one of the biggest, by the way, metrics you should be looking at if you're considering a second, third, fourth location, because this is what's going to tell you if the core location is actually operating profitably. And if you hit copy paste, could you expect the same result? So, revenue growth does not equal business strength. I mean, I could say that 3 or 4 times. So, when we say revenue growth does not equal business strength, what I mean is that you cannot simply rest on a foundation of I keep growing my revenue either by selling new patients or increasing prices and things like that. Your revenue is only one side of the equation. I always say you can't out burpee a bad diet, right? You can't out facial crappy dieting either. If you have an aesthetic client who comes in and they're getting facials, they're like, oh, this is helping me. No, it's very surface level. It's very subjective and it's very, superficial, because if you're not treating what's below the surface and having the right habits, then it's all for naught, right? And so with business, revenue growth is like that topical treatment. It's that topical thing you think is going to solve everything. But fundamentally, if you're not running a profitable business and you don't have good spending habits, it doesn't matter what you bring in revenue because you'll just be multiplying that same behavior. Operating profit reflects people, systems, space, and leadership costs. This is key. So you want to be thinking about, am I optimizing my systems, my space, my people in the right way where I'm actually fostering growth or I'm fostering more constraint? And this is where growth breaks instead of compounds. This is one of the biggest constraints that I come across as a CFO is that operating profit level. If we're not consistently hitting 20+% for operating profit, and even then we should be higher than that, but we want to be above 20% in operating profit in order to even be competing with other, med spas or surgical practices. You want to be in the upper echelon of these types of practices. You got to be north of that. And this is going to be challenging because it requires really good discipline in terms of spending and really wise decision making. How it shows up, you're hiring ahead of revenue without the margin support. So you're stacking your staff up, keeping them busy, but you don't have a supportive margin behind you in the offer profit realm. And you could be using a lot of idle time. More management layers, but no operating leverage. So we have a lot of extra management layers, but they're not contributing to growing revenue. We have rising fixed costs that outpace our growth. So let's say you take on another location, you've now doubled your rent, but you don't have double the customers, double the revenue yet. So your margins are going to they're going to tighten up a lot. Owners are working harder despite higher revenue. This is key. If you find yourself busting your butt, if you think you're working harder than you ever have, and you're actually growing your revenue, but you feel like you are just stuck chasing break even, this is your problem. This is probably your problem because you're probably not managing your budget effectively. So here are some sample questions to ask yourself. Does adding volume actually improve your profitability? Meaning, if you do more of the same thing, are you making more money at the end of the day? Or are you just multiplying thin margin? How much of revenue is consumed by labor and overhead today? What's my revenue per square foot and per provider? I'm going to keep asking you that. By the way, we got to start measuring that if you're not. How much capacity is used on revenue generating services? This is where we're talking about optimal use of rent. I mentioned this in the last video. So if you've got rooms that are dedicated to certain types of services, you have to make sure that that room is profitable by a certain amount. So you got to be looking at how many different types of services it can run in capacity per day, per week, and per provider, and see if you can leverage that space a little bit better. On top of that, what you want to be doing is looking at whether there are high margin services in those rooms. So I mentioned before, you've got your cryo, your sauna, your IV drips, whatever. And those might not be at the margin that you need them to be to justify the room space for the devices that it takes, the equipment. So if you're taking up an entire room for a cryo spa, right? And you could be using that for laser, that may not be optimal for you, depending on what your booking rates are. Are fixed costs growing faster than revenue? And could this operating model support another location or provider? So again, we get back to this idea of if we multiply, will that be good? That's a really key question to ask yourself. So here are the self-reflection questions I want you to take home and think about, and up to acquisition costs and operating costs. So the cure to operating profit, by the way, is a rock solid budget. We call this a profit plan here at Keep What You Earn. And what we do is we run clients through a profit plan that breaks out acquisition costs, operating costs, and fulfillment costs, which go into your offer profit, by the way. So you've got revenue minus fulfillment costs equals your offer profit. And then we get into operating costs and acquisition costs, which contribute into your operating profit. So acquisition costs are really cost to acquire customers. Are you making enough ROAS? ROAS stands for return on ad spend. What marketing channels are producing the highest return on investment? So this is key to understand whether your marketing is working for you or just working hard. This is where a lot of people get stuck, by the way, is they're chasing new patients, spending a ton of money on marketing, but not truly understanding how that marketing spend is contributing to their overall profitability and whether that marketing spend is going toward the items with the high offer profit. So we covered in the last video that laser treatments, things like surgical stuff, these things are creating higher margin than, say, a Botox. But are you dumping all of your ad spend into Botox ads, right? So are you pushing people to the right types of services? And are you basically educating them that they're going to need a whole treatment plan, things like that? So what are you doing with your ads that's going to contribute to your profitability? Then we get into operating costs. Are you considering the cost of someone who does what you do in the business if you're not getting paid? Let me tell you about that one. So if you are not considering into your margins, let's say you're the owner, maybe you also do injections, maybe you also do some laser treatments, maybe you're also doing a lot of the fulfillment. Are you baking into your budget the cost of you, like the cost of the president, the founder, the CEO, and your salary that you should be getting? Because if it's not you, it's going to have to be somebody else, and somebody else ain't working for free. So you have to make sure that there's enough wiggle room in your margins to be able to accommodate a salary of a person who does what you do if you ever want to take a step away from the business, which you are going to at some point. Do you periodically review the credit card expenses and trim them? Are you paying for the appropriate software and licenses for the number and department of the employees? This is key too, because you may have an EMR system with some old licenses and old employees still on it. Like your old front desk gal from God knows when ago might still have a login to your EMR system, and you're paying per license for that. How much of your monthly rent or lease is covered by service revenue? Are you measuring ROI on equipment leases and financing, clear operating budgets, technology tools, utility cost per treatment room, all of these things? Are you baking in your insurance premium costs and other expenses that contribute to overhead? And then finally, I look at labor efficiency. So, labor efficiency is actually a big contributor into offer profit, which we've already covered. But this is to consider labor efficiency for non fulfilling staff overall. So, like front desk staff, you've got admin. Are you training them properly? Are they using their time wisely? And this also goes into using your time to call customers, to generate sales, to answer the phone properly using a script. Are you paying overtime regularly? Could better scheduling reduce some labor cost here? Are you leaking extra costs in those commissions while you're preserving your margin and rewarding production? So you have to really consider what is contributing to the fact that I'm not feeling profitable at a business level. And that's really, really important as a practice owner to understand your profit at that level. So, again, going back to, you want to be about 20% or more operating profit. And the way to do this is to take your total revenue, okay? And let's say you want to average an 80% offer profit. Then you would look at that and say, okay, that means that I have 20% costs of fulfillment, direct labor, materials, consumables, things like that would be 20%. And then I would have 80% left over. Well, of that 80%, let's say we want to get to an operating profit of 20%, which means what? We have 60% to play with. 100 minus 20 equals 80, minus 60 equals 20. So we have 60% to play with of your revenue. So I'd be looking at your operating costs and your acquisition costs and saying, how do I want to divvy up that 60% among those two categories? So you may have, say, 25% to acquisition or 20% to acquisition. Let's use a round number, 20% to acquisition and 40% to operating, right? So that would be what we call a profit plan, because what we're doing is we're allocating a healthy margin. We're allocating all of those buckets to say, hey, this is what you should be targeting. This is what you should be aiming for. And if you're in that zone, great. If you're not, now you know what to double click on. Now you know what you need to investigate further. So I would encourage you, as a next step from this exercise, that you find a way to set those spending targets of acquisition and operating costs so that you can arrive at your target margin. And then you also want to understand what your practice has to generate to cover those cash needs. You got to work backward. So if you want to say hit a 20% margin just because Shannon said so, that's fine. You could use that as a baseline to start with, just to see if you can get closer to that if you're further away from it. Like if you're at a 5% margin, I don't expect you to have a 20% margin overnight. You're going to have to chip away at improving this over time. But you really have to work backward from, what do you need to be extracting as a business owner? What do you need to be making for yourself? What do you need to actually generate in order to feel like your business is profitable for your own benefit? And that's what we're going to cover in the next video. We're going to be talking about cash flow, and we're going to be talking about how, even if you're running a profitable practice that has killer operating profit, killer offer profit, you can still have terrible cash flow. I'm going to explain why, and why that is the number one constraint of most practice owners in our next video. I'll see you then.